am David Bogie.
So I'm Duncan Pelly.
I'm Dr. Jillian Sails.
My name is Sabrina Trafimo.
And I'm Ronnie Sailors, and this is the Enthinkment Circle.
I'm David Bogie, Enthinkment Circle, and we are continuing to develop the relationships between Enthinkment, enactment, and something we call the quantum storytelling, because both Charles Saunders Peirce and Louis Ralph Pondy were mathematicians, were trained in the arts of the mathematics, knew how to do the calculations of Newtonian physics, and were even doing the calculations of the quantum physics as Peirce knew them when they were starting to break out, and Pondy knew them in his training. So that's the three aspects. And when you have the three, the first and the second, the third is what attempts to resolve and mediate the duality of the first two.
So I'm Duncan Pelly, also part of the Enthinkment Circle. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Enthinkment sense-making, which is really interesting. You know, when we look at, and building on what David said a little bit, thinking about Enthinkment sense-making, refer back to that tear, right? It's when a routine itself is somehow torn, and then that opens us up to all of the possibilities. And you think about when you're in a regular, everyday kind of situation, you say, well, why can't I do that? You get told no. No, you can't do that because these rules are in place. No, you can't do that because it's not necessary. Well, when we have what White might call a cosmology episode, we call it emergency, you know, some of these kinds of contingencies, they result in a tear in our routines. And all of a sudden, all of those things that say, no, you can't do that, we start realizing, well, if I do that, I can see what's going to happen, and we better change course. Think of it almost like you're on a train, and you see that there's no track, 10 miles ahead. And what do? Do you keep doing the same thing or even speed up the train? Or do you find a way to reverse the train, build more track, build a different set of tracks? What is it you're actually doing? And two examples come to mind of Enthinkment sense-making that I think are quite powerful. And they're very contrasting. So one of them is Wyke. He talks about the Bhopal disaster in India, where they're in a chemical plant and they were so sucked into their routines. And they basically thought that nothing bad would ever happen. And they didn't, really do maintenance or anything, not because they thought that not doing maintenance was okay, but because they thought that supporting your routine of not doing maintenance was okay. And they were so entrenched in this routine that they ignored very obvious signs that there was going to be a very severe chemical meltdown in this plant. I mean, the chemicals were bubbling, they could hear it, they could touch the tank. And even though the sensors said everything was okay, everything about their sensory perception said, no, this is very much not okay. And one of the great tragedies of this is the fact that once the chemicals were leaking and people were dying, if anybody had just told them, by the way, if there's a chemical leak, wet a wash rag and stick it over your nose and your mouth, because these chemicals are very reactive with water, and that will protect you. Even that didn't make it in. So they were focused on their routines. So this is almost a failure of enactment, right? But we can shift that over to a story from Bengt Johannesson and Lena Olaisen looking at the aftermath of Hurricane Gudrun. And we know Northern Europe, they are very focused on rules, right? They like routines, procedures, this is the way they like it. Unfortunately, Hurricane Gudrun, which is interesting, yes, there are hurricanes in Sweden. That's an interesting finding of this article. But Hurricane Gudrun tore through all of that. These people had a choice in Sweden. They could follow the rules and do everything just the way they wanted to, and they would all starve to death or freeze to death in Sweden. Or they could explore that tear. Okay, the rules aren't working. We're not going to look at the regulation, but we're going to look at the spirit of the regulation. What is it we're actually supposed to be doing? And people broke all sorts of rules. You had farmers coming and delivering fuel tanks and parking them where they weren't supposed to park them. A cook from the local senior citizens home cooked meals for all the workers trying to clear the forests. People were sleeping at the airport, using this kind of like a dorm for the workers. That wasn't allowed either. And the result was quite interesting because these people learned to work together in new and unique ways, and it facilitated future cooperation long after the aftermath of Hurricane Gudrun.
I'm Dr. Jillian Sails, and what I bring is the listening and even the observation and openness to the differences of the things around us and how they can integrate and also disintegrate. And I do a kind of sense making where I sit down and I think about things, try things, fail at things. And bring story. And I think about people and how they are relating to each other. Made an observation in the world where we're not thinking about each other. We're just acting. We're doing enactments. And we're not thinking about or feeling what we are doing with each other. And so I guess what I bring is trying to think wide and deep about the potentials of opening spaces for being in relations with everybody in the world.
My name is Sabrina Trafimo, and what I bring to the table is a Heideggerian perspective, thanks to David Boji, who inspired me to look into Heidegger's thinking. For me, it is about asking questions about things that are seemingly obvious. We have taken, I think, as humans, perhaps a little bit too much for granted, and we think we know. But after reading a bit of Heidegger, I've come to the conclusion we don't necessarily know a lot about a lot of things, and that merits deeper questions. One of the points Heidegger is making is there are surface appearances, and in many cases, that is considered good enough, but in reality, it doesn't lead to understanding. Therefore, I think it is a good idea to ask questions that go beyond what we see, and also see the connections between things, what is underlying it, because everything we do really has a consequence far from what we're immediately seeing in our surroundings. And we can sit back and ask, what are we doing? What does it affect? What does this mean for somebody? What does it mean if I do this? What does it mean if I do something else? Everything has a consequence. Another perspective I have is an artistic perspective, because I do like to paint and draw. When you do that, you really have to look at details and the overall picture all at once. While you're working on one thing, you can never lose sight of the whole. And I think that is another thing that we can perhaps discuss. How does one thing relate to the whole? It isn't just about one thing, because everything is interconnected when all is said and done.
Building on what Speen's talking about in the external and internal, the external co-generates the internal, and they are one at some point. To think that we have full access to the thing in itself from the external, however, overlooks how the auto-generation, the autopoiesis of that thing occurs internally as well. There is an observer that creates that which is observed. However, for example, in a biological entity, DNA itself is one of those observers. And so, for Zizek, who takes to task Barad's concepts of autopoiesis. He calls it a sort of naive realism. And he asks, how is it that we can have an observation of the universe when to have an observer for the universe, there must be an observer to the observer? And what this means is, when we dig into it, we have to have what Barad calls a exteriority within, what Hegel calls reflection. And so, for example, the observer in observing makes manifest the thing that the observation itself is in the thing itself. This is ultimately the negation of the negation that defines the thing. What is a sword? A sword isn't the end of the sword. It is all that which the sword does not impact. That defines what isn't the sword, and everything else is the sword. So you walk into the grocery store with a sword in your hand. You have impacted the lives of all of the people that see the crazy man with the sword. That means the meaning of that sword is all the lives impacted, and all the lives impacted by the person impacted by that. But at some point, the ripples of that sword in that context disappear. And they fall into some background, and that is what isn't the sword. And then whatever isn't the sword is the sword. And so, Gadamer, who is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I keep arguing with this man in my mind, and he keeps winning. Very annoying. So, Gadamer argues we should take this concept, and he says, where is emancipatory reflection effectual? And his answer is that so often the people who claim to be emancipating are in fact, by putting aim at a system that exists, making real the elements of that system to justify their so-called emancipatory acts. And so by making real those systems, that means we do not reach some sort of emancipation, some sort of freedom from a system by observing the system. Instead, we focus ourselves into that system and generate the problems of that system. And we regenerate the problems of that system. So ultimately, from Gadamer's perspective, whether you're looking at history or present systems or future systems, although Gadamer does very little with the future, which is where Dave Boji becomes a necessity, we step back and we are always already inside of another system of understanding when we try and look at something. But far from that keeping us from getting anywhere, it actually frees us to recognize who we are and where we're coming from, properly understand what we're doing. And once we recognize, for example, that Western business schools are engaged in a form of reifying and repeating the systems of oppression, that even if they are emancipatory scholars, they are still involved in recreating, then you can take ownership of that recreation and ask, how will we recreate it? Instead of simply saying, we aren't going to do that. Recognizing our own culpability in the perpetuation of the system, not because we want to, but because we have to. And, as Dave Boji pointed out, instead of trying to stop it and standing in front of it, stepping back and flowing along with it and helping guide it.